a lot of times people are just looking at it as, oh, here's my quick prompt generator or whatever, and that's kind of all they see, and they stop seeing anything else. But when you start seeing it as a giant workflow for concept designers and motion designers, all these things, texture designers, fashion houses, et cetera, this is when it becomes truly exciting.
Unless you've been quite literally living under a rock, you know that AI has finally come to the world of art. dall-e, Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion are basically household names in the motion design industry, and we are all figuring out in real time how to grapple with the awesome power of these tools. To help figure out what it all means, we invited Dan Jeffries, Chief Intelligence Officer for Stability.ai, the company behind Stable Diffusion, to come on the podcast to talk about their AI model. Dan is a brilliant writer, speaker, and futurist, and has a lot to say about what this technology does and does not mean. We get into the moral, ethical, legal, and even philosophical ramifications of AI, and talk about the real-world use cases that are coming soon. If you're a human being trying to grapple with this brave new world, this episode is for you. And now, let's meet Dan Jeffries right after we hear from some of our amazing School of Motion alumni.
Hi.
Hey, School of Motion.
Hello there.
School of Motion courses offer such a compelling experience.
I was not part of this huge community of motion designers from all around the world.
Such a tight class and community.
It just had a huge impact on my life.
Thank you, School of Motion. I couldn't have done it without you.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on, man. It's really nice to meet you and to chat with you. And I have so many questions about this amazing technology. So I appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Right on. Well, the first thing I wanted to ask you is about your job title, because I've never heard of a Chief Information Officer. You're the CIO of Stability.ai. So maybe you could just explain what that means.
Well, it's a Chief Intelligence Officer, but a CIO actually, it used to be called Chief Information Officer when we'd use that three-letter acronym in the past. I always joke that my general job in the world is thinking for folks. And I'm very good at kind of thinking through a lot of the steps. So when people want to actualize something, they're not aware of that there's something like 40 or 50 steps that sort of have to be done to make something a reality. I'm a bit older than I look, and so I've got a lot of templates in my head. I guess I'm a well-trained AI at this point, and that I can kind of look back and go, cool, this is how other companies or other things that I've come across have done this. So this is how you build a team, or this is how you implement a policy or whatever. And I've been kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, right? And so that I've kind of got a good sense of business, good sense of legal, good sense of writing, communications, good sense of technology, good sense of business structure, these kinds of things. So that's kind of where my sort of role fits at Stability, and that's how I think of it.
Well, I'm sure you're navigating lots of landmines at this point. This is a very new technology. And there's this quote I was reminded of. It's by Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I'm sure this is not the first time someone's thrown this line at you with what you're dealing with. But tools like Stable Diffusion that Stability has created, and Midjourney and dall-e, I mean, these things are basically just magic to me. It's inconceivable that they work, and I don't really understand it. And I'm an artist, and I'm surrounded by artists all the time. There are several PhDs worth of work that have gone into these tools. But is there a way that you can help me and the audience wrap our heads around how these tools are actually doing what they do?
Well, first of all, it is magic. And look, the interesting thing about artificial intelligence, and maybe this is the best way to think about it, is if you think about traditional coding, and in traditional coding, you have a developer who thinks about all of the logic and then kind of explains that logic in a very structured programming language. They lay out the logic. That's really what it is. If this, then that, while you're waiting for this, wait for this signal, do this thing, right? It's loops, it's conditionals, it's basically structured logic, right? And that's been very effective for us as a society. If you think about like the tool we're using right now to record stuff, that's all through traditional hand coding. If you think about the browser, if you think about all the apps on your phone, the operating system on your phone, any of the apps that pop up there, the vast majority of those are traditional hand coded logic. What started to happen though is that we started to reach the limits of that hand-coded logic and what we can actually do with it. And so if you think back to the ImageN competition, which was a giant competition out of Stanford with the wonderful Fei-Fei Li as the professor there, who then was on to Google, that was a contest to do image recognition. And if you look at everything before AlexNet, and AlexNet was one of the first kind of major neural nets to use GPUs and to really kind of push the envelope, that was a lot of people trying to use traditional logic and not getting to better than 60 or sort of 60 plus % or whatever in terms of accuracy. It's very easy to do something structured, like I need to get a username and password and log in. But how do you describe what a cat is to a computer, right? It has fur, except when it doesn't. But what is fur? It has pointy ears, except when it doesn't. And what are pointy ears, right? There's no real way to describe that. And so neural networks kind of come along, and they were kind of lambasted for a long time because we didn't have the data and we didn't have the compute power to be able to do it. And it's not like theoretical physics where you can make a living just writing equations on a board and without being able to kind of test it. AI is very practical. Machine learning is very practical. You have to go do stuff with it. And we just didn't have the data or that. So once AlexNet comes along and all of a sudden crushes the competition, you all of a sudden like go from one neural network that takes it to like 80% in that year. And then all of a sudden the next year, everyone except one contestant was a neural network, and they pushed it up to like 90 plus. And then the year after that, it was already beyond sort of kind of human capability, and they had to shut the contest down, right? So it was a very quick timeline kind of using these neural nets. Sometimes neural nets kind of make people upset because then the traditional AI network even, because we want to add all of our own kind of hand-tuned logic to it. But there's an old joke from Richard Sutton that every time you fire a linguist, the language model gets better. And what we've generally found in Sutton's bitter lesson, as he calls it, is that only like scale and search really work well. And so the more that we kind of scale up compute, scale up the data, scale up the search, we're able to do these things. And so basically the neural network learns about the characteristics of the underlying data, right? And it learns to kind of approximate those things or do those kinds of things and make sort of predictions about the next bits that are happening, right? And I think DARPA describes it a bit as kind of like spreadsheets on steroids, but you can do a lot of cool things with spreadsheets on steroids. Maybe it's not truly intelligent in the way we think of it, but a squirrel we might not think of as intelligent. It's better to think of things as that there's lots of kinds of intelligent. You might think a squirrel is intelligent in the way that a human is, but you try to keep that squirrel out of your garden, and I guarantee you're going to find out that squirrel is pretty smart, right? Because it's optimized to get into your garden. And so I think these things are these narrow kind of tools that are able to do interesting things like drive a boat or drive a car or recognize images or create images now. And the diffusion process that creates sort of stable diffusion, it's trained on a lot of data. It learns how to add noise to that data and then reverse it. And then it learns to kind of add its own characteristics over time. And there's some other kind of interesting bits underneath the hood that make it happen. But these kind of diffusion models have been particularly fantastic at generative AI, which is now becoming incredibly important in the entire artificial intelligence space.
Thank you. That's a really good explanation. I want to try to dig a little bit deeper because I want to talk to you in a little bit about the, I guess, potential limitations of this technology and how far really it can go. I've seen videos where there's noise and it just looks like static. And then it slowly clears up and turns into like something that looks like a master painter made it. I mean, are these neural networks, are they basically just learning what the most common pixel color is when I see this pixel color over here, and it just like you get enough data and it has no idea what it's making. It just knows that in general, this word goes with this arrangement of pixels, and voila, now we have an astronaut riding a horse. Is that sort of how they work?
I mean, it's not necessarily pixels. In other words, like it's sometimes more interesting to look back at things like a convolutional neural network, right, where it had sort of layers of things. And when they would kind of peel back some of what was happening under the hood, you would see kind of each layer learns a different set of characteristics. So one of it might sort of learn about edges. One of it might learn about swirls and blobs of color. One of them might learn about pixels. One of them might learn about different layers of it. And it kind of learns these different characteristics, right? Or what they call features, essentially. We might think of features as like, well, someone has a large nose or a small nose or an Aquilian nose, or they might have bright eyes or small eyes. Yeah, they might have like large lips, or they might have a bald head, or they might have a lot of hair, at least on their face, but not on their head. But there's kind of sub-characteristics of those things, like the way these kind of lines work together, the way that the colors kind of are adjacent to each other, those kinds of things are what it starts to learn over time. And there's a similar sort of process, although it's different in the way it works in diffusion, and that it's modeling the adding noise to the image and then the reversal of that process, right? And it doesn't become a one-to-one in that it immediately kind of recreates the image in there, although it's doing that in its training session, but then it's essentially learning how to improvise from there, right? And that's really the important thing, is that I think some people, especially, have kind of tried to characterize it as it's just this kind of giant database of image or whatever. It's not stitching together a bunch of images and saying that this is how it works. It's not searching through a database. That's not how it works. And in many ways, it's similar to how an artist learns in life. It's just we learn slightly differently, but not that differently than machines. Like when I was doing drawing and painting in school, it was one of my first loves. I had a book called Drawing Lessons from the Great Masters, and I learned how to draw all the old pictures from Da Vinci and Raphael and all those. And there was a lot of analysis in there of the shading and how those lines came together, right? And if you think about when the picture was sort of zoomed in and there's an overlapping of shadows or whatever in a particular area and the way lines come together, that's a feature that it can learn. And so it learns a lot of these kind of granular features. It doesn't necessarily learn them on this kind of huge scale. It learns them on sort of a smaller scale. And it learns slightly differently in terms of how it kind of puts those things together. We may have kind of sub-algorithms that we don't understand where we know certain types of pattern matching. I know a face should be at the top and should be connected by a neck and shoulders. And if it's not right, there's something in my brain intuitively that goes, wait a minute, the head shouldn't be floating off in space. So sometimes you see those weird kind of Cronenberg images where it hasn't quite learned that underlying sort of geometry. And of course, the mangled hands, there's the memes on with Show Me Your AI. There was a great one on with Blade Runner where they were asking the question and he's trying to figure out whether it's AI, and then he goes, "Show me your hands," and it's and it has 8 fingers and whatever. So those details are challenging for it to learn, but not insurmountable.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, you're making me think when you learn to draw, one of the things, and I think it's probably the hardest thing to teach, is to stop seeing objects as the object itself. Don't see it as hands. Just look at the shape and the shading and just recreate that. Ignore what it is. And that's actually kind of a way to get better at doing that. And it seems like that's what these tools are doing automatically. They don't know that it's a hand, obviously, because they wouldn't put 8 fingers on it. That's really interesting. I want to understand why this year everything seemed to happen all at the same time. Yeah, I know you've been talking about this stuff for years, as have other people, but I think up until maybe February or March of this year, it never occurred to me that this was possible. And everyone else I've talked to in our industry felt the same way. So was there some breakthrough? Was it some new GPU came out? What was it?
So I don't think so. My philosophy fits very much with Steven Johnson's. If you ever watched him, he's a fantastic kind of writer. He wrote the book How We Got to Now, and he has a BBC series where he kind of goes through the history of glass, for instance, and how important it is to society over time and everything that it's been in, from the screen on your phone to fiber optic cables moving things across the world to keeping out sunlight so that certain aspects of sunlight so that you can't actually get a sunburn inside the house because it filters that, but lets through the visible rays, and mirrors and what they meant to the development of consciousness. So there's kind of this thing where there's sort of this hummingbird effect that kind of happens, right? Where there's a lot of different developments and then it has these beneficial developments in an unexpected domain. And so I think what happened was you just had a lot of research being poured into it. And what was interesting is when you look back at neural nets, they were not doing well for a long period of time. There was 1 or 2 universities in Canada that were kind of keeping the flame alive when most people thought they're just toys and they're really not going to be able to do anything. So there wasn't enough compute. There wasn't enough data like we talked about before. And because of that, you didn't have a lot of people except the hardcore true believers kind of doing it. And they told kids, don't study this. It's a waste of time, right? So that's why we don't have enough ML research now and people are kind of scrambling to learn this stuff. But then you started getting things like ImageNet, right? And then you start saying, wait a minute, well, GPUs are very good at doing matrix math. In other words, instead of it being these kind of old school processors where you had 4 or 5 cores, it's actually better when you have thousands of little cores in there and you can spread the math across it like a giant spreadsheet, right? So that started to happen. And then you had companies like Google start hiring those researchers academically. And there was a bunch of kind of breakthroughs where they were kind of training up neural translation, right? And they trained up neural translation, which was suddenly made Google Translate much better in a huge leap, right? Before that, they had a rule-based kind of coded system, and then they had to develop their own kind of processor CPUs to deal with that. And then NVIDIA saw that and was like, wait a minute, we want to be on this game. So they started pouring all their huge budget and research and R&D into it. And so they made kind of huge leaps. So you have this kind of perfect storm of the internet wells up with lots and lots of data. You have all these kind of chips getting smarter, and NVIDIA going from kind of a pure gaming company to focused on artificial intelligence. And then you have more and more people kind of getting into it, pouring research dollars into it, primarily out of the tech companies, et cetera. But then you start to get these independent research labs. You get folks like OpenAI that pour sort of billions of dollars into this as kind of pure research. And they start doing stuff that you just couldn't have done years ago. You couldn't have taken a cluster of 10,000 GPUs and put them together and get the data and do it. It would have been inordinately expensive. So I think the compute sort of expanded, plus the pricing came down, plus we started to have the data, and plus we had interest in it because we were starting to see little breakthroughs. There's an old joke that once something works, we don't call it AI anymore. So like when you talk to your phone and it understands what you're saying, you just call that voice recognition. That's artificial intelligence. Right? We just don't call it AI anymore. Remember what I said earlier? We reached the limits of what we could do with traditional coding. There's some things that we're probably always going to do that way, but there's a whole bunch of things that we simply cannot solve with traditional coding. It doesn't matter if we poured $1 trillion into it and 1 million developers. We likely would not be able to solve many of the challenges that we can solve with artificial intelligence. And that's sort of what happened. Is I think you had a lot of these little building blocks kind of waiting to be put together, and it was sort of it was just time for it to make the leap.
So just sort of it bubbled up underneath the zeitgeist and then it cracked the surface and everyone saw it. I'm fascinated. I follow a bunch of, indie hackers and entrepreneurs online. And it's been amazing to me how quickly little micro tools have spun up, built on top of these platforms. I mean, there's Avatar AI, which you upload like 20 photos of yourself and it makes different styles of you that you can use as your profile picture. There's another one that just popped up, which is near and dear to my heart, which is a hairstyle generator where it takes your face, puts hair on it. I mean, I think we could benefit from this, Dan. So one of the big differences with Stable Diffusion, though, and I'm curious why this decision was made, is it's open source. So dall-e, Midjourney, they had sort of demo periods, but now you have to pay to use them. Stable Diffusion is open source, so you don't have to pay. So why was that decision made, and what does that mean in terms of a business that's raised a lot of money?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of success with open source movements in the past. I was at Red Hat for a decade, and so I've seen firsthand, and I started there when I think there were 1,400 people or so, and was there for 10 years and saw it grow to much larger over time. In the early days, we were trying to explain why Linux wasn't communism and going to destroy the world, right? And now when you think about it, it seems almost crazy today because Linux literally runs everything. It runs all the public clouds, including Microsoft, right, in their business. If Microsoft had been successful at crushing it in the early days, they would have shot their future business in the foot, right? And because now it powers a great deal of the Azure cloud. It powers nuclear subs. It powers almost all of the world's supercomputers. It powers routers that are in your house, edge devices. It powers Android. It's just everywhere. And it's because it's ubiquitous and because people were able to take it, bend it, break it, and think about it in a new way. So when you put something out in that way, it allows kind of the creative forces of a lot of different people to do it. The challenge is when you just keep it behind, an API and you kind of strictly say what people can and can't do with it, you're not going to be able to think of everything that they could do with it, right? Because there's just an infinite pool of creativity out there. And no matter how smart your team is, you're not going to be able to think of everything. And so what you end up with dall-e and Midjourney, by the way, the great Midjourney is looking fantastic with the new version they do of tremendous work. OpenAI is amazing. They do incredible work. I love them. But, there's really only a painting program out of both of those. But when I saw Stable Diffusion, what it really showed is that there's this pent-up demand of people who are traditional coders, great technologists, IT people who are dabblers, artists with a technical bent, whatever, all of a sudden who could now take a fully fledged, powerful model and figure out ways that nobody else had thought of. So I've seen synthetic brain scans developed, the synthetic lung scans developed, right? I was just reading about the Mayo Clinic training up a diffusion model to basically do synthetic lung cancer development. They weren't using Stable Diffusion, but they trained up a diffusion model. But they probably got the idea from the fact that Stable Diffusion had suddenly been so powerful out there, right? And why is that important? Because be able to get that data. Remember, I said that the data is really important. And sometimes when you're talking about medical data, there's a lot of challenges to getting that data. Maybe you don't have enough of it, right? Because you just don't have enough instances that are unique for the model to be able to learn the features of cancer so that it can do better detections. I saw people doing AR stuff with showing wallpaper suddenly in a room so that they could look around, right? I've seen fantastic artists sort of building it into their workflow. And I understand the kind of existential scare that sometimes people feel about the job uncertainty and these kinds of things. We live in an uncertain world. But my sense of it is that it's a tool and it's just going to be worked into the workflow. You still need the human intelligence. And the perfect example is I saw a fellow who was an awesome illustrator, and they did the underpainting of a cool frog and then put it through image to image and it generated an awesome looking frog, and then they pulled it into Photoshop and painted glasses and different outfit on it and all kinds, and then put that back through image to image and did 20 iterations of that, and then went, oh, wait a minute, that one's cool. I'm going to pull that one in and mess with that one, right? So it's this kind of rapid iteration. And I've always thought of these creative tools, when I look at them, it's going to be just like that, right? Someone's going to be playing the guitar and they're going to feed it to the machine and they're going to go, give me 20 continuations of that. And you go, wait a minute, number 15 is awesome. Like, let me hear that one again. Okay, number 15, give me more of that and give me 100 iterations of that. Okay, cool. That's cool. Oh, wait a minute, I'm going to play this here, right? So it's going to be this kind of like, this centaur is what we call it, right? It's really like it's a collaborative tool. And a centaur really came out of the idea of like, of Gary Kasparov after he lost to Deep Blue in chess, right? And that was sort of this big moment where we thought that was going to be the breakthrough, but it turned out actually just be kind of a brute force tree search. So it wasn't very intelligent, right? But it was still impressive, right? The Deep Blue was very impressive, but it wasn't true kind of artificial intelligence yet, which is why we didn't see the breakthrough starting then. But he held a contest the next year where you could enter as an AI, a person, or an AI-human combo, and the AI-human combo ended up winning. And it was really a collection of a couple of expert players, not even grandmasters, playing with an AI that beat the grandmasters and beat the grandmaster artificial intelligence programs. And so that's, to me, what I think artificial intelligence is for a huge chunk of time. It's not that it won't ever do some types of jobs, right? We do sometimes change the jobs in history. But again, I don't know that everybody's like calling for us to go back to like whale oil lamps and slaughtering giant sperm whales and digging the gunk out of their head just because because we're afraid of the electric light bulb. So I think, but the vast majority of things that we have here are really about these kind of tools and workflows. And I see it's going to speed up and it's going to create new kinds of workflows for artists. A lot of times people are just looking at it as, oh, here's my quick prompt generator or whatever, and that's kind of all they see and they stop seeing anything else. But when you start seeing it as a giant workflow for concept designers and motion designers, all these things, texture designers, fashion houses, et cetera, this is when it becomes truly exciting.
Yeah, I want to get into in a little bit the philosophy behind all of this, because I think you're exactly right. Like, my take is that the obvious use case for this, especially in our industry, is generating concepts and art direction. One of the things I would do is I'd get on Google image search. And if I'm doing a commercial about whatever, pizza, I'll type in pizza and you'll see 1,000 images of pizza in different styles and it triggers something. And I think that this is just another way to do that. But I think there are some differences with this versus, I don't know, like say if you're a 3D artist and you're modeling a scene and you need a model of a guitar. Well, you could take a week and model the guitar. You could just you could buy a model that someone else has done. Is that cheating? Does that cheapen what you've done? I don't think so. But if you didn't really have to do anything to get the image other than imagine it and type it in, does that cheapen it? So I don't want you to answer that yet. I want to save that because I think that's going to be fun to get into. I want to hear a little bit more about like where this technology is going. You brought up some really cool use cases to create artificial data that can be used, I'm assuming, to train humans and also to train other AIs. But specifically thinking about like image generation, I mean, the fidelity just gets better and better, but there are certain things that, like you mentioned, hands, and also I notice eyes seem to give these tools trouble sometimes, or if there's multiple people in the scene, sometimes they sort of intersect in weird ways. What does it take to fix all of that stuff? Is it just a matter of more data? Or is it possible that there is some limitation that will bump up against that really you can't be overcome through this method?
I would say it's probably more data and better data. When you look at it, like if you look at kind of the Chinchilla paper, that was sort of a giant breakthrough where they were able to essentially say, like, if you make the data a lot better, that actually improves the performance of the model a tremendous amount. And you're starting to see this kind of focus on data quality, or what they call sort of data-centric AI that came out of Andrew Ng, right? And this idea that we spent all this time kind of figuring out the models and tweaking the models and experimenting and doing all these things. And if there was noise in the data, like if you were thinking about trying to create a model that can understand what I'm saying in the car, and maybe I only had 10% of samples where the kids were yelling, "Are we there yet?" And the music was too loud and there was like wind noise in the background. And so every time that happens, it's particularly bad at being able to understand that, right? So the typical approach in the past would have been go and tweak the algorithm, go and tweak the model a bunch until you can overcome that deficiency in the data. The answer now would be go back and augment or enhance the data. I might go purchase a bunch of sounds of, say, from a sound database or whatever, and first a sound database of wind and music and kids babbling and like car noises or whatever. And I could then programmatically take the samples that I already have and make new samples where I've added that to kind of the background noise. If I wanted to train something to detect kind of boat crashes visually, I'm not going to have a lot of footage of boat crashes, but I could probably create them with Unreal Engine or again, augmenting some of the engines that are there, right? And so that kind of that kind of creates that. So you want to have better data. I mean, certainly we could get I've been advocating for a hand database. I do find it kind of funny that like hands were some of the hardest things to draw as an artist for myself when I was a kid, and almost every artist. Like you said, you have to kind of break it down to the geometry and shadow level and forget that it's a hand and just see kind of the intersection between the fingers and how far that is and this distance between this distance, and there's no real edge, so don't draw a line around it. It's all the play of shadow. So there's all these kind of intricate things you have to learn. I think the same with artificial intelligence is that it's actually not surprising that two of the most expressive parts of the human body, right, the eyes, right, the window to the soul, and the hands are incredibly challenging because where our eyes are, whether I'm kind of looking intently at you or looking off into the distance or kind of like looking up into the right or thinking about something or whatever, well, that matches the pose that you sort of understand intuitively because you understand kind of human mechanisms. The hand is also the most flexible thing. You have all these digits that can move independently, right? They can come together in a fist. They can open up. They can do like one finger pointing. They can touch like this, right? They can make all these sort of symbols. And then and then it's attached to this arm, which is kind of free floating. It can be in all these different shapes and mean this kind of different expression. And so I think the challenge is that artificial intelligence hasn't quite understood that level of flexibility and that level of expression. And it's something that like with a larger set of data would probably learn it over time. It's never going to be perfect. No. And sometimes actually this is the ding from the people who are like, AI today is stupid and it'll never kind of achieve kind of true intelligence. And again, with usually the benchmark being sort of human intelligence, with the lack of understanding that there are many types of intelligence. Again, we don't think of a squirrel as human level intelligent, but again, try to keep it out of your garden, right? And there are many types of intelligence that are perfectly functional and useful. We don't need human level intelligence. In fact, AGI, I could care less. That's great if we ever get there. But in the short term, there are millions of applications for narrow kind of not too smart AI. And so I don't need this kind of perfection. Like if you think about something like a self-driving car, okay, we kill 1.2 million people on the road every year and 50 million people are injured. So when the media, when a Tesla crashes, are like, look at this evil technology, it's destroyed everything, it'll never work. And you're like, okay, yeah, but like during that same time that one Tesla crashed, there were 10,000 people getting injured, right? So if you look at the machines, like were they ever going to be perfect? No, there's no human that's perfect. Humans actually are tremendously terrible drivers. It's something that requires kind of perfect concentration for an extended period of time, which is something we don't do very well, right? So the cars don't need to have this sort of higher level of intelligence to be able to deal with 99.9% of the scenarios that it's going to face. And in fact, Waymo talked about this. They essentially said, look, the cars are 99% of the way there. The 1% is like the hardest part, right? And what they're really looking for is these weird edge cases. Somebody just jumps out into the middle, or there's something that looks like a barrier, but it's not, or a piece of trash is not actually a solid thing that's going to cause a crash, or something that is solid that could cause you to veer off the road, and these kind of weird edge case situations that we're used to dealing with. You go down a road, it's closed off. Are you allowed to back up or drive over the sidewalk? Or these kinds of decisions are very challenging, right? And so those are these edge cases. And I would agree that that's challenging to get to. But if these cars, and maybe like if you're just thinking about trucks driving on the road or on the highway or whatever, if they're able to reduce the amount of fatalities by half, for instance, when does this get good enough? And again, when you think about if I bring this back to art tools and not sort of kind of life and death thing, it just, right now, it can be awesome for prototyping. It doesn't even need to be sort of production level thing where you automatically get a perfect asset at the end of it, right? Where it's just that it has to be good for like, okay, I want to iterate and prototype and get all these ideas and oh wait, that one's really cool. And now I can kind of apply my artistic skills to make it even better and get it to a finished production. I think that's fantastic. To me, if it never gets beyond that, it's still really cool.
I wonder how big of an effect like the Terminator series had on the public perception of these things. Because there is definitely like a fear baked in of like giving a machine too much control. And as an artist, I totally understand it too. So we talked about certain things that are going to be really hard to ever get perfect. And I've also seen workarounds of this where maybe if you get an image out of Stable Diffusion, the eyes are messed up, but then there's some other AI tool that is really good at eyes and you run it back through that and now the eyes are fine. I know a lot of people are doing that.
It becomes a workflow, right? Like a higher level workflow where you're chaining it through a series of tools to get a particular effect.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people do like they'll upload 20 images of themselves. They train the model on that. Then they get a bunch of options of you could look like this if as an anime character. And then they run that through a thing that cuts out the background. And it all happens in a few minutes. And I think that's really powerful. I gave a talk earlier this year at a conference in Chicago, and it was a bunch of motion designers, mostly mostly 3D artists. And all of this stuff had just started to really like pop in the public consciousness. And I was showing all these images, these beautiful renders. And then I said, but it's okay because none of these things can animate anything yet. But then the next slide was some people have been using, and I don't know what the terminology is, but they were using some, I guess, program or some application built on Stable Diffusion called Deforum that was actually creating animations using the tool. And there's this weird quality to every single one I've seen. It's like a fever dream. There's this coherence problem where things pop up and they don't quite seem right. And my intuition is that like, okay, the nature of the way this tool works is causing that. And I'm sure that's going to get better. But right now it's way off. Like if you wanted a photorealistic shot of something, we're not very close to that, I think. If you want something really cool looking, we're there. If you want to do a music video, you could use it. But how much of a challenge is it to get from where we are? You can have a photorealistic image, but 24 frames a second of a shot that it looks indistinguishable from something that's shot with a camera. How far off are we from that, and how difficult is that?
I don't know that it's necessarily difficult. I think it's a matter of kind of the researchers focusing in on it with the correct data set and the correct approach to the problem. Right. And so I've talked to a company, for instance, that edits image and they have the beginning of the image and they have the transformations that the artist did of that and then the final kind of rendition. So we're talking about potentially training up a model that's able to look at those kind of transitions and then approximate those kind of transitions. And that could be a path to doing those kinds of things. If you think about the way animators worked in the past, right, it's funny because I think the maker of Ghost in the Shell said you can't even make animation the way we used to do in the past, where you had everyone kind of hand drawing everything, right? And people won't even do it. They don't even want to start at the sort of interframe kind of. Because it's a slow, boring process, right? So you would have these kind of keyframe animators, right, who would draw like Mickey Mouse like this, and then like this, and then you'd have someone who would draw all the interim steps in between. Yeah. So my sense is that you're probably going to start to see breakthroughs where people are able to kind of think about it from a keyframe perspective and feed the machine various types of keyframes. And then I think the AI will be actually relatively quick learning how to like approximate movements in between those. And so I do think that we get to sort of animation relatively quickly. And we're already sort of working on some animation stuff. I know some other folks are too. Like you said, right now, a lot of it looks like a fever dream where it kind of, throws a head in the back of the head in one frame. And that's all cool as like, I think we'll look back on those as kind of early AI kind of aesthetic of those kinds of things. But I do think we get to the point where we're able to do video and imagery and these kinds of things in the not too distant future. And again, I think it's just going to, the same way it's really just going to enhance the sort of workflow of what we do, right? I mean, I think at some point in time, for instance, I wrote a blog post 10, 15 or 20 years ago where I said, look, video games and film will converge, right? And they'll converge when video game engines get to the point of photorealism and like near perfect physics, right? And I think we're almost there, probably with Unreal 5, right? And very close. And by the way, they're using the same assets for like The Mandalorian and the PlayStation is just showing a different amount by doing mathematical approximations of it. So even if it's Unreal 6 or 7 or whatever that gets us there, eventually you reach a point where like, what more of an engine do you need, right? It essentially can already do photorealism or any style, and it can do these kind of physics. So now, is that a bad thing? Well, I don't know. Avatar costs, $340 million or whatever, and that's out of the range of the average person. But what if it's at a point where now the average person in film school who's like got a great creative team could do an Avatar for $20 million? What kind of explosion of creativity do we get at that point? And then what kind of explosion of creativity do you get for when people are able to like create some kind of storyboarding system, right? Where they're able to like do a bunch of prompts to kind of create storyboards based on their ideas and their text. And then from that, the AI is able to look at the storyboards and craft out something that's rough approximation of it or whatever that artists can take from there. And then it reduces it to $5 or $10 million. What it means is there's more creativity. It means there's more options. And there's a number of folks who are able to break through who you would have never seen because they wouldn't have got through the old gate guardians. And to me, whenever you're enabling more creativity, that's a good thing. Yes. That means you're going to get a higher volume, and that means that there's going to be a lot of crap to wade through. There's already a lot of crap to wade through, right? So from my standpoint, it's never a bad thing when you're enabling more creativity, when you're kind of bringing down the barriers to entry. And then also these tools also allow people to kind of express themselves in new ways. In the same way that, the brush, in certain kinds of paint don't replace the pencil. They just offer a new type of expression.
Let's talk a little bit more about this animation thing. So, I mean, the way that Stable Diffusion and dall-e and Midjourney, the way they create images, there's no underlying 3D scene or 3D model. But I have seen other things pop up on Twitter and other places where, okay, here's an AI that makes geometry. You type in plane and it gives you a plane. And then there's this other technology, I don't know if it's related, but neural radiance fields where you can get these sort of 3D approximations of a scene with the lighting and the reflection. And do you think that it's really the combination of all of these things that's going to turn into text to 90-minute action movie starring Tom Cruise, as opposed to text to image, which is what we have now?
I don't think the technology, even super advanced, in other words, we absolutely get to generating 3D models of stuff from text in the very near future. That the work is already being done on it. It's just, and we've had a number of groups banging on our door with with data sets, potential commercial partnerships to do that. The researchers are chomping at the bit to do it. We're not the only ones. There's plenty of folks out there who are already researching it. There's stuff that's come out of Google. There's stuff that's come out of NVIDIA where they're able to approximate point clouds and then smooth over the mesh over the top of it and then give real information that you could point into any kind of 3D program, whether it's, I don't know what the kids are using today, but back in the day I used are we still using that? I don't know.
It's out there. The kids like Blender these days. Blender open source, by the way. So, yeah,
so the tools change, but they get a little bit better over time. So look, that's absolutely going to happen. I am not sure that with the limitations of the tools that we have now, in terms of if I just max out how far they can go, based on the technology exists now. And that's what I always do as a futurist. I do kind of a probability analysis in my head of major branches, right? That kind of float out into the future, right? And if I do sort of a maximization of 3D and image generation or sort of sound generation, video generation, et cetera, what I don't get to is describe the movie. It just makes it completely in photorealistic fashion and tells the story and sets the cinematic direction.
A soundtrack by John Williams and the whole thing.
Yeah, like that. I don't see the technology, even if it's fully maxed out, kind of achieving that. But I do see all those tools very much changing the way that film and streaming and television and illustration work, right? In the same way that when we look back at Jurassic Park, and there's a great documentary on it where they're like, well, you can't use digital stuff. That doesn't make any sense. And the fractal effects are the only thing that'll work. And then they made this. They had two folks who were like, we absolutely could do this. And they were able to make the T-Rex working overtime, kind of figuring it out on their own. And all of a sudden they were doing this sort of digital film editing, right? And when people were still literally cutting and pasting things together. Yeah. And they were like, oh, this is the way everyone's going to do it, right? That's what Spielberg was saying at the time. People are like, what? If you look at the media at the time, they're like, that's crazy. Why would anyone do this? And of course now, it's incredibly rare for anyone to use sort of physical film, or you have seen a resurgence of practical effects, or actually the merger of practical and digital effects now, right? You see some of that stuff with the Real Engine in Disney and stuff where they put up those giant screens that are able to shift and move with the actors. And so they're no longer just in a suit with little dots all over them and talking to a green screen and trying to pretend there's a dragon, right? There would have to be some unobtainium level breakthrough that I don't see on the horizon yet, or I don't see it in the research. I don't see it as a possibility where I would be able to go, even if I could write it out in a 20-page treatment, that it would then generate the next, Mission Impossible 55. I don't see that happening yet. I don't know what that technology would be that would get us there, but I think that kind of cuts to the heart of people sort of worrying about this kind of thing, that we would suddenly be able to kind of do it at that level. I think if we're able to do it at that level, we have sort of a very different level of intelligence, artificial intelligence, that I don't see in the pipeline currently.
That is what artists worry about. I think this is a good segue to kind of talk about this stuff. So I've heard people pontificate on the internet, as they do, that exactly that situation I described. You're going to be able to type in, I want a movie with dinosaurs in Lakewood Ranch, Florida, with a hurricane outside, and our hero, Dan Jeffries, is fighting, and it'll create it. And the thing that, I don't know, I will say I was totally wrong about the potential of these AI image generation tools. If you'd asked me a year ago, will you be able to type in a sentence and it gives you this high fidelity thing? I would say no, and I was wrong. But the thing that I still feel pretty strongly about is that even as incredible as these tools are, they're only as powerful as the concepts and the ideas from the artist that has those ideas, right?
Yeah.
And so when I gave this talk, I'm in a room with a lot of people who they make their living producing work, and it's going to be easier and easier to produce the work, right? So the value of that work, and it may eventually even be the monetary value of a 3D modeler, for example, is going to be lower because these tools just make it easier, democratizes it. So then I'm curious, and you're an artist too, so like what then is the important thing that artists should be focusing on, knowing that, okay, it's going to be a lot easier in the future, maybe in 5 years, being a texture artist, which used to require like really super specialized knowledge. Now you're just going to go out with your iPhone, you're going to point it at the texture you want, and this AI is just going to make it. But what's the important thing that these AIs really, even, from your perspective, projecting out, they won't be able to do? What's the thing that artists should be focusing on?
I mean, I think any artist should just be like thinking of it as another tool that they get familiar with, like a paintbrush or a camera or anything else, right? And the problem is that really the media has sort of treated it unfairly, and I think some folks have been understandably.
No, the media doesn't do that, Dan.
I think sometimes, we have a long history of the way AI has been portrayed. It's either been killer robots or like the end of the world, right? Or like this existential thing, or like the death of all jobs. I've even written in my own short stories like 25 years ago of like robots like doing this kind of thing. But I think it's a fairly tired theme at this point, and I think it's also unfortunately created this kind of weird existential fear. And I don't know. When I think about it, I don't really actually worry about like sentient robots because humans don't have any trouble like being jerks. And so I worry about sometimes narrow AI in the hands of like evil, selfish jerks kind of directing that thing that has no consciousness, right? So I don't worry about the kind of AI rising up and taking over. I don't worry about this kind of mythical, death of all jobs kind of thing. I think, first of all, we've already kind of recreated all the jobs multiple times in history. Like you didn't hunt the water buffalo and tan leather to make your clothes today. Like you didn't hunt down your own food. Like you hunted it down in the grocery store. And there was a whole series of folks who were feeding that grocery store. And then you're able to do other things like host podcasts. So I think that jobs do change over time. And I think it would be disingenuous to say that they won't change at all. But in the same way as like if you're a radiologist, you should know that like artificial intelligence is going to assist in terms of radiology. So you should be comfortable with that and like utilizing it, but still developing your own intuition, your own kind of critical sense of it. When I think about it in terms of like, we're probably not that far away from large language models being able to crank out an article in the style of Dan Jeffries. I don't really worry about it. I'm still Dan Jeffries. I'm still going to be able to create my articles. I still have my thoughts and my experience and the things that I'm doing in my life that are going to inform the things that I want to create as an artist, right? I've been doing it for 20 years. I don't care if it is. And in fact, I'll use that tool probably in the same iterative way to say like, wait a minute, I'm really having trouble writing a conclusion of this. Like go look at the story that I'm in my 5th draft on and like give me a better ending. Okay, that's pretty cool. I'm going to change this and this. And like it gives me a new idea to move forward with. So I would say just embrace the tools. Don't fall into this kind of fallacy, right? That like that the AI is this sort of inhuman thing that's going to take over the world or kill everyone or whatever. It's just a science fiction story. And science fiction stories are about conflict. Stories are about conflict, right? It's like when the media portrays this, it's always about the conflict because fear drives clicks. Right. Mm-hmm. And even if you're kind of a member of what's the awesome uplifting story Reddit, there's like 20 million people on it. I forget the name of it, but it's like even that one, when I go on the uplifting stories, which is about puppy dogs being saved and like a new cure for cancer, you go, oh, these are great stories. And you read them for about 2 minutes. And then human nature, I go right back to reading like The Economist and like it's all ending and at the end of the world and the economy is crashing and war. I think we are by our nature in many ways sort of fear-based creatures. It animates a lot of the things. It animates like us creating art and building cities and like forming these kinds of things. But there are other emotions, right? Joy is the kind of true creativity of art, right? And I think as long as people are kind of willing to evolve, right? And understanding that like nobody's thing is fixed in time. We want to be in a state of thriving and growing. And to do that, it means just sort of adapting to the kind of new things that are available to us and embracing them.
I mean, this is a tale as old as time. There's like some famous story that I remember learning as a kid of the guy who he had a giant sledgehammer and he would drive railroad spikes and then some machine came along that could do it faster and they raced. And of course the machine wins and the guy dies of a heart attack. But it's sort of like this parable about like technology comes for us all. And when I gave this talk in Chicago, I was sort of urging everybody to like do some soul searching and figure out like, what is it about making the art that is fulfilling, right? Is it the end result that you're getting? Or is it the process of doing it? because as the end result gets easier and more democratized, it does feel like a little bit of an ego hit. If you worked for 15 years to be able to make a 3D render that looks a certain way, and now, a 12-year-old that can type in the right prompt can get the exact same image, what does that mean, right, as an artist? And it is funny too, because there are things that AI tools have been helping with in our industry for years already, like rotoscoping is one. No one complains that all the rotoscopers are out of work now. No one complains about that. But when it comes to doing style frames for a commercial or something like that, and being able to knock out 20 variations and pitch those without really having to actually open Photoshop one time, it is a little bit of an ego hit, I think. And so I'm just curious. This isn't really Stability AI's responsibility to figure this out for society, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, as an artist, a lot of times our ego gets wrapped up in the result of what we're doing. And really my philosophy is it should be about the process of doing it. And if that brings you joy, then guess what? You're an artist. How do you think about that in the context of these tools making the result easier to get?
I think we're talking about the difference between sort of commercial art and like the philosophy or the feeling of art. And for me, most certainly, that joy that you're talking about, that process of zoning out and losing track of time, that kind of flow experience of writing is why I still write. I make some pretty good money off of writing. I could probably do it full time if I wanted to focus on it. It's not quite as lucrative as technology, but I could certainly make a living doing it and be quite happy about it, maybe happier than some of the stress sometimes in the tech world, right? But for me, actually, the most important thing is when I have those 2 or 3 hours where I'm just focused and everything's on snooze mode and my phone is off and nobody else is sort of bothering me and able to just zone in with my thoughts and focus and type out something. And I lose track of that time and I feel better the rest of the day. I feel like I've fulfilled my purpose in life. And that's exciting. That's not ever going to go away. People still have the option to create those things. Now, when we're talking about the process of commercial art, essentially being sped up in some way, I would argue that we don't have less art because the tools have been democratized. I would argue we have more. People right now are talking about the golden age of streaming. I can't wait to go home and watch The Crown, which just dropped. I've been watching Andor, and it's some of the best television I've ever seen. It's sci-fi or not. And I look at the graphics behind it and I go, man, and you look at the stuff from when we were kids and it looks so janky and horrible. And I look at the stuff they're just producing on television now, and it looks so immersive. It's astonishing. It's incredible. And then you have this amazing acting. And we have so much content. We have tons of streaming networks now. We have content creators on the web. People have cameras in their phone. They're creating a million different things per second, right? You've got all of these different things now. I think we have more art now than we've ever had in the history of mankind, right? And that's because of the democratization of all of these tools. It's because of tools like Photoshop. It's because of the World Wide Web and changes in distribution. It's because of Kindle. And AI is really just going to accelerate that again. I think when people look at it and they go, oh my gosh, again, the rotoscopers I'm not going to be able to do this in this way, right? Yes, that is a challenge, right? And if we have to kind of adapt, but that's tough. And some people are better at adaptation than others. And I understand where a lot of the artists are coming from. And I think some folks in the community get very us versus them about that kind of thing. It's technology, just deal with it. No, I don't think about it that way either. It's painful sometimes to adapt or to change, to learn a new tool. It's also tremendously exciting. It's tremendously exciting. And there's a joy in learning how to learn a new thing from scratch. Creativity is about change. There's joy in learning a new process. There's joy in adaptation, and there's joy in being a part of this eternal creative flow where life is always changing and never static.
Preach. I love it. I love that, man. All right. So let's talk about a common objection I see. And I'm not even sure it's an objection because, as we were talking before we started recording, I've been really surprised by how accepting of this new technology my industry has been. I expected a lot more gnashing of teeth and tearing of clothes. They're going to come for our jobs. And I haven't really seen that. I've seen a lot of artists embrace this. But one criticism that I have seen, and I suspect that it's not entirely accurate, is some version of this. It's these AI models, they were trained on millions and billions of images on the internet, some of which I may have made, and I own the copyright to, and I didn't give you permission to crawl the internet and grab these images. And now you've built a tool that is using my image as an inspiration to make new ones. So I'm curious, is that perception of it at all accurate? And how would you kind of respond to that?
Look, I think Stability is very much working with the community to think of things like a kind of no robots style text where, a do not crawl style text. I think it's something we have to be sensitive to and we have to think about. I can sympathize and sort of understand. I would say historically, you also have to sort of be careful what you wish for, though, right? There's been a kind of push to say somebody should be able to sort of copyright a style now. And if you look back at the history of courts for 30 or 40 years, they've come down on the opposite side of that again and again, right? So in other words, if you create an exact reproduction and you take somebody's image off the wall and you use that in your film or in your advertisement without telling them, that's always been something that's totally illegal, right? And should be, right? At the same time, this idea that you could sort of copyright a style, imagine kind of the sort of wormhole or sort of that opens up if you sort of allow that. And suddenly I go out tomorrow and copyright anime style. I go out tomorrow and copyright heavy metal. I go out tomorrow and copyright like bald guy wearing a t-shirt or whatever and like sue everyone as the patent troll, right? There's artistic patent trolls. There's a reason that the courts have sort of understood that. Now, maybe that has to change in the area of AI. I don't know, but it will have a ripple effect that I think folks should think carefully about. I also think that, again, there was like early days of the web, there was a movement to say like every website that you link to, you should be able to get permission to them. You can imagine how that sort of would have destroyed the World Wide Web, right? It's like you would have this whole army of people inside CNN like answering these requests, and the small site would never get back to you, so you'd never be able to link to it. Like it would just be impossible. It would have kind of destroyed the nature of it. So my thinking is like, look, humans learn from looking at other people's art. I certainly did when I was drawing. I certainly learned how to write staccato and run-on sentences from Ernest Hemingway and other great artists, and I've mashed it up into my own kind of evolution over time, whereas maybe my early stuff looks a lot like Hemingway with all of its, strengths and weaknesses. But over time, you learn which of those techniques you like. And as you get better as an artist and 10 or 20 years of experience, right? And so imagine if Tom Brady had to call up like Joe Montana in order to learn how to study footage to throw a football. Imagine if you had to get the permission of every artist to draw their thing, right? If you had to learn from all the different sort of anime folks and you had to get their permission just to learn how to draw your style. So I think AI learns in a very similar way. And I think that it's just been, that was maybe the concern that sort of surprised me the most. I sort of predicted all of the other ones, kind of the other concerns that folks would have. And so none of them really have surprised me at all. That one sort of took me a little by surprise. Again, though, I'm sensitive to it. I understand it. If people want to be able to opt out of things, then I think as a community, we'll be able to come up with an answer to that. I think that's fair if they want. I think what will happen is in the short period of time, there'll be a small group of people who won't not want to be trained on, but over time, it'll be something that folks don't even think about, right? In 10 years, it won't even really be a debate. You'll just say, this is the way that sort of things have worked. And you want your stuff to be able to be in there and you want to be able to use it for your own style or whatever. But I think people should understand the ripple effects of saying something like, we should be able to just copyright this style or those kinds of things. It's because, again, there's a reason the courts haven't come down on that before. And you don't want me copywriting anime style and putting everyone out of business or making them pay a toll every time they decide to put something up on ArtStation. But you do want to get to a point maybe where people want to put in a do not crawl kind of text or something like that the various machine learning groups would respect it. I think we have to find a healthy middle ground, a healthy balance, right? And to me, whenever I think of it, I'm sort of a radical centrist. I always try to think of how do we get to a practical solution to things that's fair to 80% of the folks, and maybe the 10% on the far left and the far right are upset, and so be it. You're not going to be able to please everyone in the world, but I think we can get to a solution that is beneficial for the
everybody can be equally unhappy, and then that's when
you've compromised well. When everyone gets most of what they want, but not everything.
No one should be happy. So I think I love talking about this stuff. I think there's sort of like the legal questions of it, right? Which I'm sure those will be litigated out over the next decades, and then there's the moral questions. And like here's an example that I don't know if I've seen this, but I've heard people talking about this kind of thing, right? And maybe it's not even real yet. Maybe it's just a fear. But when you go on these tools and you type in a prompt, you can type in a unicorn flying through the air, backlit by the moon in the style of, and name this artist. And if you put a Picasso or Andy Warhol, that's one thing. If you put an artist that happens to be a modern working 3D artist that's just really well known and has a particular style that brands come to them, pay them lots of money to make something in that style. And now you don't have to, because this thing can make your style. And it's the style associated with your name. I think that's where it gets a little squirrely feeling. And I don't know what the solution is. I mean, have there been conversations about that's an edge case for sure, but are conversations about that sort of thing going on? And is that influencing, I guess, the direction of the product at all?
I mean, I don't have a great answer to that question, that one particular edge case. And I think you can always come up with a lot of different sort of edge cases. Yeah. I think it's been I think too many folks have focused on the idea that you could put in a particular name and get back an approximation of that style, because I don't think that the vast majority of people using those tools Like it's actually one variable in a variable of like 20 or 50 things. And that the vast majority of people who are, well, I just want this in the style of so-and-so are just sort of playing around. Like they're not like creating a commercial thing. They're not trying to like go sell that artwork or do that kind of thing. Although there's been some NFT.
Yeah, not yet anyway.
Momos or whatever. But the vast majority of people are not really doing that. And I think they underestimate, I think Kelly Yuga was saying this on Twitter, that the vast majority of folks seem to underestimate that most people want to create their own unique style through the prompt. In other words, they want to combine 50 different keywords of various things. And again, that style, they say, well, it's just one aspect of it. This person's name is just one variable within there. And it's usually the mixture of 3 or 4 different people plus 25 other keywords of like metallic and like cinematic lighting and like digital paint style or whatever. And I think the vast majority of people want to create kind of their own unique thing. They're not really interested in copying anyone else, in the same way that if you're an artist, you're not really interested in like I learned from Hemingway, but I don't want to just write like Hemingway. I wanted to learn like the interesting stuff that Hemingway does and weave that into my own creation so that when I'm writing a short, punchy scene, I learn why he was choosing staccato sentences or run-on sentences for action to kind of keep it flowing. But I don't want it to be exactly the same. I want to understand the underlying thought process behind it, right? And so I think the vast majority of folks want to really do that, right? And they want to create something unique. And I've also actually seen, by the way, artists themselves training themselves into the package and then using it again as an iteration. I saw a very famous artist typing in prompts in the style of his work, and in order to create iterations of potential sculptures, either resin or bronze or whatever, that he could iterate on in different tools, right? And I was like, oh man, that's super cool. Like it's like having an avatar of yourself in a way that like can kind of iterate on things. I don't appreciate when folks who are in the autistic community are totally dismissive of things. I think there's a middle ground, and I think there's legitimate concerns at times, but I think in general, over time, we're going to evolve solutions to these kinds of things, right? We're going to say, like, if it's an advertising campaign where somebody sort of mimicked a famous photographer or whatever, like the industry will figure out like whether that's even a good idea for you to do that because you maybe never be able to work with that artist again, or is there some sort of legal ramification to do it? I don't have a good answer to those things, but I do know that over time, society will sort of evolve a fair answer to those kinds of things. And I trust society to figure those things out. And technology is not outside of us. I mean, there's this idea that technology is this external thing. Technology it comes from us. It's an extension of us, and it's a part of us, right? And when it changes us and changes the way that nature works, we adapt to it. We always find a way to integrate a new technology. We find a way to kind of evolve into it, and we create new regulations for cars when we just had horses and carriages before. We create new ways of kind of dealing with those cars over time. In the early days, we had no idea how fast they should go or whether you should wear a seatbelt. Even like wearing a seatbelt was controversial. Oh my gosh, should we be allowed to do that, or should we be able to force people to do that? Literally, that was the debate, right? But over time, very few people would think putting on a seatbelt anymore, right? Even though that was a tremendous debate. It really was. How dare you make me wear a seatbelt? Right? It was actually the debate at the time. So I think, again, there's always kind of this push-pull that happens, and then the system stabilizes. And people are able to come to a middle ground where there's a consensus answer for these kinds of things, and that plays out over time naturally.
Yeah, it's making me think it's almost like you're open sourcing that part of this process, which is really, I mean, I think that's the only way to do it. You can't centrally plan how society is going to react to something like this and figure out all the rules ahead of time. I think you have to kind of bump into those rough edges, right?
You do, and that's the way that all like great ideas have been filtered out into the world. It's the way that all technologies have filtered out into the world. They filter out into society, and then there's some good things that you can do with it. There's some bad things. There's some stuff in between, and we learn to kind of mitigate the bad things and sort of embrace the good side of those things. And we through a combination of consensus and regulation and sort of like best practices for doing things and evolution over time. And I think that's the nature of how society develops. It's the nature of the way we sort of evolved as a species.
So on that topic, why don't we like go a little deeper into like the potential bad things that could happen because of this technology? And recently Adobe had their big annual conference, Adobe Max, and they have a lot of AI tools finding their way into Photoshop and other things like that. And they made a big point this year that they're doing a lot of work to try and ensure that this stuff is used ethically. I mean, I think the obvious example would be to deep fake the president of the United States saying something horrible about and causing World War III. I mean, I think this is probably like a real danger of having tools like this be so easily accessible. And I don't know what you do about that. So I'm curious, what's your philosophy on, okay, now there's a new weapon out there. I was thinking of the famous quote from Oppenheimer when he saw the nuclear bomb go off for the first time. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And so this technology, like, theoretically could be used to do some pretty bad stuff. Are there ways to safeguard against that? What are companies like Stability doing to kind of prevent worst case scenarios?
Stability's firing up a contest now for like $200,000 to build for the community to sort of build deepfake detectors, and then we'll just open source that for free and give it out to the world. My sense is that the way that it'll essentially work is a bit in the way that sort of spam filters have worked, right? And that is like initially you kind of had these traditional hand-coded rules to try to stop spam, but then they only worked to 60 or 70%, but then they weren't very effective and the spammers would get around them. Then you started to see kind of these more machine learning-based Bayesian approaches to it, and they start getting better and better over time. The spammers will then kind of take that tool and like learn how to get around it by injecting certain keywords or whatever so that the spam got through anyway. But I would argue spam is largely a solved problem at this point. The vast majority of commercial software that you get, if you're on Gmail or whatever, you're just not going to see that 99.9% of spam. And that's because eventually over time, the tools were there to detect it or mitigate it. I think we'll sort of see the same thing here. We'll see the sort of rise of kind of tools on either side. I also want to say, though, that like really nobody's been waiting around for diffusion models to do deepfakes, right? I mean, again, and there's been a shift in the way we think about these things, right? It's like Photoshop has been able to kind of put celebrity heads on bodies or whatever, and these kinds of things, and the skilled artist could do it. Now, does it get sort of potentially easier over time? Sure. But there's already kind of machine learning models that are already being used in the Ukraine war and on both sides or whatever to make fake videos and statements. So those kinds of things are already happening. So as a society, we already really have to deal with it. And we're going to need better deepfake detectors. We're going to need better sort of tools. Maybe it's to authenticate images. Maybe it's like maybe it's hidden sort of information in the images. We're sort of looking at some stuff like that on a research side, where you could potentially have like a sort of hidden watermarks or things of that nature in there. I think a lot of researchers are kind of looking at those things, and you're going to have tools that are going to develop over time. Maybe there's some sort of cryptographic technique that allows you to kind of authenticate the image as it's coming off of the camera or things like that. I think there's also been a shift it's a little puzzling in some respects, where we've changed the concept of where sort of the responsibility lies in a lot of things, right? And again, I think in the old days, if somebody put a celebrity head on a different body in Photoshop, we didn't call up the executives of Photoshop and say, look, you can't put out Photoshop until you find a way to make sure this never, ever happens, right? We've somehow gotten to this place with artificial intelligence that we're supposed to be able to mitigate like every possible sort of human behavior. It would be like saying like, well, you can't give anyone a credit card because until you can figure out every way that they'll potentially commit fraud with that thing. I think that's a strange shift for society. It actually concerns me a great deal. I think that like there's these overwhelming benefits that are super important for folks to understand, right? Like we haven't said to the kitchen knife manufacturers that you have to mitigate, like it can only be used for cutting vegetables. And if you can't mitigate somebody cutting their finger with it or stabbing somebody, then you can't put this out. And to me, that's strange. It is strange. And I understand that every technology exists on a continuum of good to bad. To me, artificial intelligence is very much in the center. It can be used for good and bad things, but I think the vast majority of people are good, and the vast majority of people are going to use it for good. And maybe a gun is like farther to the side of like the dark side, but I could still use it to hunt and feed my family or protect my family, right? Whereas a lamp might be farther to the side of light, but I could still pick it up and hit you over the head with it, right? But we haven't told the light bulb and the light manufacturers, look, you can't put the light out unless you can make sure nobody ever gets hit over the head with this thing. But I do think for the vast majority of things, the vast majority of people are good. And the benefits, when we have a sort of red teams out there in the world looking at what AI can do wrong or be harmful, they should also be companies should also be spinning up a green team, and we're doing that as well, red and green teams. The green teams to basically do an analysis of, well, what would happen if we don't release this technology? What myriad benefits of synthetic cancer scans and like the ability to create new wallpapers and the ability to create myself in 12 different styles, and what are the downsides and the benefits to society that are lost from releasing these things? And I think that's just as important. And somehow we just focused on the dark side to the extent of all else. And it kind of saddens me in a lot of ways, because I just feel like there's so many good benefits and the vast majority of people are good. And if people do something wrong or illegal with it, then they should face the blame for that in the same way that it works now.
I love the kitchen knife metaphor. And I mean, I think you're right. Part of it is just a doom gets clicks. And I think that's kind of why anything negative kind of rises to the top these days. Like, thinking, like going back to that Oppenheimer quote and the nuclear, that's probably not a fair comparison at all.
That's a little tough.
Yeah, I know. It's almost like comparing someone to Hitler. Once you've gone there, it's
like you've already jumped the shark. You've gone
exactly.
to Hitler, weapons.
Just to play devil's advocate, and hopefully this holds, but like the world developed nuclear technology. The United States used it in World War II, and other countries have nukes. But there's this understanding that we're not going to use this technology. We have it, but let's not use it because it's opening Pandora's box. I guess there is a case where there is something that is in kind of in a category all by itself. And so would you say
autonomous killing machines? Yeah, no, autonomous killing machines fall into that, right? I mean, there's already groups at the UN that are looking into that seriously, and whatever, and whether those things should be banned. But there's also probably an arms race that allows that potentially to happen, or those kinds of things. Those kinds of things, I think, are super important for society to debate. But again, the analogy, and this is where, again, if we go too far on the doomsday scenario. So if you think about my idea that technology exists on a continuum, all technologies exist on a continuum. This is, I can drink water from this, but I could also hit you over the head with it. But mostly I'm going to drink water from it. Okay.
Mostly,
and the 99.99% of the people are going to drink water from this thing. And so the one edge case where somebody decides to hit somebody does not mean we should not have this water thing. So I think, but when you're talking about something like a nuclear weapon, you're talking about something whose very purpose is to destroy a lot of things very quickly. That is what it is. It's a bomb. That is not a fair comparison to like artificial intelligence, right? If I created an artificial intelligence that was just designed to kill or harm people and to like do targeting practice or whatever, then yes, that should be heavily regulated and or like banished, and something that we would want to think very deeply of as a society. But the rest of the artificial intelligence technology generally, I would say, falls on the much farther either on the spectrum of good or somewhere in the middle. And that when we use these kind of like extreme analogies, it creates a misunderstanding about the nature of those things. So, of course, we want to regulate nuclear weapons. But I think somebody else made the analogy of AI as a nuclear weapon. That is an absurd observation. I'm sorry, but it is an absurd observation. And it's completely unfair. If you're worried about the AI is getting too intelligent, I would argue that people need to learn how to think more clearly before they worry about that. Because like really artificial intelligence is not even close to a nuclear weapon. Maybe AGI in this mythical sense like will become something, but I don't know. Frankly, I wonder if the AIs would just do a better job. I mean, we certainly can't do a worse job when I think about the kind of cruel, sadistic, horrific kind of conquerors and kings and queens of the days of old. Maybe the AI will do a better job. Maybe we haven't even considered that possibility.
That's the next project, the AI monarchy.
But again, I think it's just super important to be careful about these kind of extreme examples. And I think, once again, it kind of creates this unnecessary fear that really is unrealistic. And that people, again, need to look at the kind of each individual tool and use case. And they need to look at it with a clear mind and logic and sort of a sane sort of middle ground understanding. And certainly if you want to think about something like lethal machines or whatever, that's a category that must be considered seriously. But the rest of this stuff, it needs to be considered in a very different way.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And I think the way you nailed it there, it's like nuclear weapons are literally designed to just destroy stuff. This AI technology could very likely going to help cure certain cancers and things like that, right? And it could be used by bad actors. I'm thinking of, there's this guy, Palmer Luckey. He invented the Oculus VR headset. That was his company. And now he runs like a weapons startup. Like he makes weapons. And there's another kind of way to look at this too, which is that Stability.ai and Midjourney and dall-e, it's like these are being created in developed Western countries where we have like a legal system and a morality that most people have that, I mean, I think we're all on the same page. Most people don't want to hurt each other with this stuff, but there are other bad actors out there. And so we need to develop the technology too, because they're going to be doing it whether we do it or not. And so I'd rather have the good guys developing it. So that's also another thing that I think is good to keep in mind. There's
examples in totalitarian states where they use things for scaling surveillance and those kinds of things. And we should be really wary of those kinds of things. And we should be, those are the things we should be out there yelling about and protesting and making sure that we don't allow that to kind of creep into our own societies as well, right? I find those cases to be incredibly unethical and that I couldn't support. I also understand that like sometimes, I don't know, somebody said something about they created a thing that could generate like a positive drug discovery, novel sort of chemicals for combating cancer. And then somebody put out a paper saying, oh my God, it can also be used to create sort of like disease chemicals or chemicals that hurt people. I'm like, well, chemistry can be used to do that. And a rogue chemist, and once the chemist understands how like to combine chemicals, they could do it to make things that cure cancer. They could do it to poison people. So again, it falls into the hands of the user and the person who's doing this. And again, I believe very much in the vast majority of people being good, and that these tools are too important, right, in our ability to fight cancer, discover new drugs, create new ways of doing art and work, to create new ways of expressing ourselves, to create translations for languages that don't have a great deal of speakers anymore. And we don't want to lose all those precious texts that exist. And now we can start to train these gigantic models that are able to preserve some of these languages in ways that have never been done. We're also able to look back at like historical records and things that we had trouble translating from archaeology sites, and suddenly we're able to translate that and understand what people were thinking in the past in these kind of ancient scripts and stuff. There's just so many cool things, and it's so exciting. And I want people to be excited about it.
So I guess the last question I have for you, Dan, so this has been really awesome and eye-opening, and I do feel like I'm a natural optimist, so I was already super excited about all these tools. I feel even more excited because you've given out 100 examples of other things that I never thought of, like ways that this technology can be used. So maybe why don't we wrap up, like you're a futurist and a writer, and clearly like you think about this stuff a lot. Could you kind of maybe paint a picture of like, what is it going to look like in 5, 10, 20 years when this technology is more mature? What are the things that we're not even thinking about now? I mean, image creation, great. It makes it easier to do our jobs. But what are the other things that are going to come out of these models, these experiments, the research that's being done and all that?
I mean, you're going to have these amazing sort of like cutting edge models that are always being hosted and being developed by big companies, and then they'll get cheaper over time and kind of trickle down to the hands of regular folks who are able to think about brand new things to do with them and run them on smaller levels of compute. You'll probably have a kind of like Akamai of inference that's kind of running all over the world that's able to kind of run these gigantic models, and you'll be able to consume them via APIs, and you'll be able to consume them like directly. The amazing kinds of things we're going to be able to do, I think it's going to revolutionize our ability to do drug discovery. I think the sort of protein folding was one of the first examples of it, where we maybe synthesized 1 million different proteins and in our entire history, and it took like months and lots of expensive equipment to do it. And we're able to make predictions for 200 million proteins kind of overnight. And what does that mean for medicine as we kind of apply that sort of technology? It certainly means kind of personalized medicine. In other words, like if you think about now, people go, gosh, why are drugs so expensive? Because it's really expensive to research drugs to be able to cure things. So the big pharma companies are primarily going to focus on what? They're going to focus on the things that hurt or kill the most people. They're going to focus on cancer or different types of cancer, but there's all kinds of smaller diseases that I would never look at. And a friend of mine got skin writing, where you kind of get itchiness all the time and you kind of have to take an allergy pill every couple of days, and if you kind of do it, it brings up a red welt. No one's going to create a drug for that. No one's going to spend the R&D money to do it. But an artificial intelligence might be able to look at all the different characteristics of that particular disease, look through the drugs that have been created, or look through the possible combinations and create that. And then maybe there's a drug 3D printer, and these things already exist, chemical 3D printers or a DNA 3D printer, that you're able to go to the drugstore and get personalized medicine for just your particular disease, right? And maybe there's another artificial intelligence that's looking at those particular drugs to make sure they pass certain baselines so that they're not going to hurt people, and that they pass certain characteristics by running them through virtual tests, right? Those kinds of things start to happen. So you almost have an AI FDA. I think you're going to have breakthroughs in economics where we're able to kind of analyze the way systems are working in real time. We're already starting to see this now, where we're seeing like states are able to go, wait a minute, that country might not be telling the full truth about their economic production, because we're looking at all the container ships that are coming out of there, and we're calculating that, we're putting that up against kind of the things that already exist. I think we've already talked about some of the other ones, like cars. Certainly, I'm not convinced that we're going to solve any sort of climate issues by just eating one less burger and like occasionally not flushing the toilet. I think it's going to take much more larger things, right? And so I think if artificial intelligence were able to sort of reduce the amount of cars on the road, right, and reduce the fatalities, all of a sudden you're able to say, you're in a big city and you've spread out 10,000 cars, and you can get a car anywhere in the city within 2 minutes based on kind of the distribution of those cars, and they can get you anywhere. I think that's revolutionary. It's awesome. And all of a sudden those parking lots can be converted back into very interesting things. I think we're going to have new material science, right? We're going to be able to look at all kinds of different materials and design new things. I think we're going to have turtles all the way down, where we're already seeing AI designing new chips. I think we'll have personal assistants, right, that know us probably better than we know ourselves. And you'll be able to say, I forgot my sister's birthday, I'm sorry, and I'm on my way to her house, and it's going to look at what it knows about her and what it knows about you and how old she is and how old you are and like how much time you've got. And okay, she does like beer, but she doesn't like wine, and she's not into like chocolate. So like there's a wine store, and you should probably pick up a Merlot on this way, and there's another one in case you missed that one, right? And suddenly you're on the way to your house. I think those kinds of things are going to be awesome. I think I'm always an optimist, very excited about things. I know sometimes that there's a downside to these things, but like humans, like I said, we have a dark side, and we've done negative things with or without technologies throughout time. We've had wars, we've had conquests, we've had these kinds of things. That aspect of human nature is unchanged, but our ability to create and do new things and improve, I think the vast majority of people, it's one of the luckiest times to be alive. I think we're one of the luckiest 1% of 1% to ever live. So we are really in a golden age of material science. We're in a golden age of like science and technology. We're in a golden age of like mortality and longevity and health. All of that has been because of technology. And it doesn't mean that we couldn't have any setbacks and that we don't have setbacks along the way. It doesn't mean we haven't had some terrible things that have come out of that as well. Weapons of war, World War II is incredibly destructive because of those tools versus swords and stones. But when I look at like the vast majority of human history, I think this is absolutely the luckiest time to be alive. We've got just things getting better. And when too often we're looking at all the negative things in life, it's like the great statistician I once saw says, if I keep showing you the bottom of my shoe all the time, you're going to think it's the whole shoe. And it's just not. This thing I have right here keeps my drink cold for the entire day or warm the entire day without any ice. We don't even think about this thing. This is magical. This is awesome to have this thing. And I just think we're going to have more and more of those things, and people just should embrace it and be excited to be alive because it's an amazing, amazing time.
I want to thank Dan for coming on. He has incredible demands made on his time these days, as you can imagine, and it was an honor to chat with him. Check out his Substack, Future Histories, at danieljeffries.substack.com to go deeper into his thoughts and ideas about the technology that we discussed in the episode. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.